All right, folks, part 2 of international trade. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to combine both the U.S. and Vietnam's constraint onto one graph here, and also focus on why it is that U.S. and Vietnam would choose to produce at point B, even though the U.S. has a comparative advantage in producing apples, only apples, and Vietnam has a comparative advantage in producing oranges and only oranges. So first and foremost, let's go ahead and look at the graph. We can now draw a larger graph to represent both countries. And now again, we can put on the x-axis apples, measured in tons. On the y-axis, we can put oranges, also measured in tons. And now we're going to have, let's use 800. On the x-axis, that's 0, 900 on the y-axis as our points. So if you remember, the United States either could produce at point A, point B, point C, and point A would be 0 apples or 400 oranges. That's point A for the United States. The U.S. could also produce 400 apples and 200 oranges. That's point B. Or the U.S. can produce at point C 800 apples and no oranges. And now we can draw the U.S.'s constraint that looks as such. At the same time, we also looked at Vietnam's and their constraint, where they could produce either all oranges at 900 and no apples. Vietnam could produce at 150 apples and 450 oranges, somewhere around here, point B. Or Vietnam can produce 300 apples and no oranges at point C. And now we can draw Vietnam's budget constraint that looks like that. So we could label this as US and Vietnam. So now we go back to the chart and see exactly as to why the US and Vietnam would rather produce at point B as opposed to focusing on its comparative advantage. So for the United States, we saw that point B would be for apples and oranges. It would be at 400 apples, 200 oranges, 400 apples, 200 oranges, point B, United States. And for Vietnam, here we have apples, oranges, point B, be 150 apples and 450 oranges. Now again, we were arguing that it would be best for both countries to focus on its comparative advantage, which means producing a good at a lower opportunity cost, and then being able to trade with another country. So if we are going to focus on the U.S.'s opportunity costs, lowering the opportunity costs, its comparative advantage, we would then get point C, that the U.S. would produce only apples and no oranges. Apples, oranges, 800 apples, no oranges. And for Vietnam, we would tell Vietnam to only produce oranges and not apples. which would mean for Vietnam, it would be 900 oranges, no apples, and 900 oranges total. So let's say without trade, US and Vietnam, if they were to produce at point B, they could have a total production of 400 plus 150 gives us a total apples in the market of 550 apples. Total oranges in the economy would be 200 plus 450, 650 oranges. That's a lot of apples and oranges. But if the US and Vietnam decides to trade with one another, focusing on its comparative advantage, US apples, Vietnam oranges, now we can see the total number of apples produced in the economy, 800 apples and 900 oranges. Clearly, there are more apples and oranges available when both countries engage in trade. And again, trade usually is a 1-to-1. One apple for one orange. And by enabling both countries to trade 1-to-1, the US at point C could then export 100 of its apples to Vietnam. Vietnam could then ship 100 of its oranges to the United States. And by being able to do that, both countries are able to create a new type of constraint that looks like that. Now in part one, we were talking about that the US would like to produce somewhere around this region, but cannot due to scarce resources. Vietnam would also like to produce somewhere in this region, but they cannot because of scarce resources. But because of trade, both countries are able to find its comparative advantage, US apples, Vietnam oranges, and this allows both countries to create a new constraint that allows each country to be better off somewhere along this point.